Joining us now on the podcast this week is Theresa Miller. Hi, Theresa, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
It is an absolute pleasure. And although it says it on the screen, do you want to give us a bit of an overview on what you do as a role and what all those acronyms mean?
Yeah. So, let's start with the acronyms. So I do run a website, 24/7 IT Connection. And I do think that, the whole point of that is sharing knowledge with the community, which then, lends to being part of different communities, which is all the acronyms. So, very proud to be a Microsoft MVP, a Citrix CTP, and a VMware vExpert for many years now. And they're really there's a rare few of us in the world that carry all those. So I'm kind of proud of it.
I can't think of many others, especially that have maintained them for so long as well. So I think when I first started blogging, I think VMware vExpert was perhaps one of the things I was aiming for and never achieved. But I have set up a ESXi within the last couple of weeks, so I'm not
nice.
My skills are not completely dead. But we're going to talk about VDI today. And that's an area where I think when I first met you 9 years ago, you were doing a lot of Citrix stuff way back then. And I had been for some time. So you've got a load of experience in the VDI and virtual desktop space.
I do. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time not only hands-on deploying and architecting it, but then being part of the communities, get to share and educate others. So I'm really excited to talk about this with you today because the landscape has changed so much, especially in the last couple of years when we saw a shift to remote work.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden there's these new companies popping up and such a monumental shift to the cloud as well. So you're seeing a lot of the traditional players like Citrix and VMware, they're integrating with cloud more so. And you're seeing Microsoft has spent a ton of time with their Azure Virtual Desktop deployment, all of which, I think for a lot of these companies was in the works prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic just, shifted adoption and just changed the space a lot.
Yeah, I think a common trope across different customers and industries has been people needed to work remotely. They couldn't necessarily get the physical desktops out to them. Some customers even had people remoting in from home. It wasn't necessarily secure enough for them to use their own device. Shortages of laptops as well. So if they wanted to use their own device, they needed some sort of VDI platform span up quite quickly. And if you've got Citrix there to build upon or something like that, that was great. But where I work, as obviously a Microsoft partner, a lot of AVD, either small scale or big scale, wide deployments, POCs, and then building upon that as well. And of course, more lately, Windows 365 as well, both business and the enterprise versions, which is, I don't know, it surprised me because if I went back 4 years ago, I would have thought that as Microsoft have been moving in that trajectory of, building laptops, selling devices, having the thick client effectively, that there would be less need for VDI. Why isn't that the case apart from sort of bring your own device? Why are companies really sort of still going down that route?
So let's step back and let's talk about Microsoft a little bit. And so I want to call that out because if we just study one company, it does show the adoption trend. So you mentioned 3 and 4 years ago.
Yeah.
I actually know people who are, proud to be part of the team that has pushed out Azure Virtual Desktop, and they saw the pandemic accelerate not only the work they were doing, they were working their tail ends off, but the adoption spiked.
Yeah.
And I think part of that, like if we just talk about Microsoft, they understand enterprise and they already had a lot of the market to begin with. And so if you're all of a sudden in this situation, like you were saying, Steve, where you need to get desktops out to users in a more secure way. Look at ransomware attacks. Like ransomware attacks have just skyrocketed. It's a business in itself, right? Because of the Bitcoin industry. They're making money off of it left and right. Organizations needed a secure way to deploy desktops. And I think, de facto, a lot of Microsoft customers just started to deploy the Azure Virtual Desktop. But I think there's more to that, right? Where other companies like VMware and Citrix, and we're even seeing smaller companies, new cloud-based companies pop up. You've got Remo 3, Cameo, and then I think Frame has been around for a while as well, and they were purchased by Nutanix. Like, you're seeing other offerings. I don't think anybody's actually solved the VDI problem. So, and customers are about choice and simplicity. So we're just kind of seeing this market shift. I don't think there'll be a new leader. I think it's about organizational choice.
Yeah. So there's the three. I mean, I see because on the Practical 365 podcast, we obviously see what Microsoft do when it comes to VDI for Teams. It is slightly different to what I might see with customers, where we don't see much VMware Horizon out there. There's a lot of Citrix and a lot of MSPs and partners that do Citrix and have always done that, and maybe then moved into AVD and Windows 365 over time. But Microsoft do clearly, support VMware Horizon. They support Citrix, Zen Desktop, and of course they support AVD and Windows 365 for the offload of media, which is essential, really. I suppose if you are running a thin client of some sort and you need to use Teams, which most of our listeners will probably be doing. But then across other vendors as well, like Cisco, there's a similar common set of supported platforms as well. I think Cisco don't support AVD, but they support Cisco. They support Citrix, and they support VMware. But then you've got all those other players in the market that are left out somewhat. How do those smaller players work in that market if people are using Microsoft and solutions like that then? Because how do you deploy Frame if you use Cisco or Teams?
So if we take the Frame example, so I did a POC with Frame some time ago for one of my previous employers. And we were specifically looking for a cloud integration, and we were looking for the ability to actually resell a product. So becoming like a service provider of one of our solutions. And what I learned through that POC was that at the end of the day, the back end is still Windows. Yeah. And so if Windows is at play and it's a supported operating system you're deploying, even if it's in Azure, because Frame will integrate with Azure, then you're going to be able to take advantage of the ability to deploy M365 applications. Now, there are some catches to that, right? Like performance of any Microsoft 365 application can struggle in a virtual setting. So a lot of the times, especially if you're a Microsoft-centric environment, you're going to leverage FS Logics to be able to help with that. And I think they've been slow adopting on the Teams side, but I think it's getting off to a point where you should be able to successfully virtualize and leverage Teams virtually. Did you have something to say?
So FS Logics being its support platform it runs on a Windows server or Windows machine. It doesn't matter what the VDI platform is, but those media offload. So effectively, I guess simply put, you've got an add-in that runs client side, you've got an add-in that runs VDI side, and the voice channel and the video channel go directly from the client rather than from the VDI platform, so that you have reasonable performance when you're using it. And that's, to me, that's that's a must. Though, to be fair, I've used virtual machines to use my work PC, and I don't use those add-ins, and it works fine. You know, I'll remote in and I'll pass through the camera, but I'm running that fairly sort of close, so I know it can work, but it doesn't seem like that'd be the best sort of scalable solution. So, is there any reason not to lean towards vendors with those support? You know, if you were going to go down that VMware route, Citrix route on top of those platforms, because it does seem to me that you would be better off picking something that can run on anything. If you would,
yeah, that's a good point. So, but I think there's maybe something we should clarify. So Citrix, for example, even running the Microsoft 365 applications, there's always been issues to work through. It's not perfect. Yeah. You're going to find the same thing with the VMware virtual deployments as well. They do have built-in integrations that can improve performance, but in my experiences, you're still going to jump through a few hoops. There's going to be a configuration required. And if you're not getting what you need performance-wise as an organization out of some of those just base included foundational tools, then you are going to want to look to a third-party product. Now, FSLogix was acquired by Microsoft. It works best with the Microsoft products.
I obviously, as I say, I work for Microsoft product, but surely there's no reason why FSLogix would work any worse than Citrix or VMware, right? It should work just as well. It
was actually... So when FSLogix was an independent company, it very much was Citrix and VMware focused. So you absolutely could deploy an FSLogix configuration in your Citrix environment or VMware environment and take advantage of the benefits. But I think probably similar to you. I mean, I'm a huge fan of taking whatever's foundational in the product and trying to use that before you start adding third-party tools on top of things. To get the performance you need. I just think the Microsoft 365 suite as a whole has always proven it needs a little extra something to be happy.
Yes, yeah. I mean, gone, I hope, are the days of, I remember probably when we first met, probably 2013 maybe, I remember our Citrix team where I worked had to set up basically a lab environment to validate the performance for PST caching of an OST caching on network based on some Microsoft guidance around remote desktop scenarios, limiting the cache on Outlook 2013 to a certain amount for one of our customers with a few hundred people, a construction company where going to Office 365 at the time, and you need to make sure that it works and performs well, and it's not going to run in online mode very well. And that worked fine. And there was similar sort of guidance that came out from Citrix around things to do that would mitigate some of those aspects. But it does seem almost for all of these deployments around AVD that FSLogix is sort of the way to go. It's the default effectively that you would definitely do, unless it was perhaps one of those Windows 365 business machines that's very self-contained. You know, it's your machine in the cloud. But it's that media offload that gets me. Because it just seemed kind of fundamental, right? Unless you were going to run Teams locally, if you were planning out a voice deployment, the voice cannot go from your client machine at home to the data center and then out to the Microsoft cloud, especially over like a VPN tunnel, which it probably would.
Yeah,
and that avoiding that dog leg is like key. But what I've been heartened by is Microsoft have been improving all of these products, these VDI add-ins, at a similar rate. VMware always seems a month behind. Citrix and AVD get the features. You know, one of the biggest bits of feedback was not being able to see multiple people at the same time with the add-ins. That's fixed now. Another one was screen sharing control not working. Again, that's coming. But almost like an arms race to which would get what first. And I always wonder why VMware's last. Because it's is it less deployed than Citrix to an AVD? Or is it just a Microsoft, prioritizations, I suppose?
That's a really great question that I don't have an answer to. I think from an adoption perspective, it's very geographic specific. I've definitely seen a lot of Citrix out in Europe.
Yeah.
In Zen Desktop specifically, but if you come over to the US, there's actually a lot more VMware.
Yeah.
So I don't know that explains the lag that you describe, except that maybe geographically there's just maybe they're distributing those changes at a slower run rate to EMEA. I don't know. I'm not sure, but
so yeah. Well, I suppose we could ask the product group for an exact reason why. But the other thing that, when you're looking at these choices for what if you need a VDI platform, you're going to run Microsoft 365 on it. VMware does seem to have some additional features in Horizon. I've used VMware Workstation. I remember when you could start to package up and deploy VMs that would run in Player, and they were all packaged up and you could send them out on a CD way back in the day. And Horizon seems to consume some of those features as well, where you can have an image that is VDI, but then you can push it to a desktop as well. Does that mitigate a lot of those kind of problems, or does it cause more problems because of latency to the apps? Is that a thing that people should ever look at, or is it really an edge case thing?
It's a good question. So when you talk about deploying a virtual desktop off to hardware, there could be it's use case specific.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give a little bit of a longer answer to that question, because I think it's important to put yourself in the shoes of the organization making decisions about the organization.
Yeah.
So let's say you're a healthcare organization, and in healthcare, you have different security points for how you deal with your corporate data. So patient bedside, you're probably going to have a virtual desktop or virtual applications on a thin client, because if the patient walked up to that and was able to get in like a traditional Windows machine, they probably are going to get into some things they shouldn't. Your nursing station might have something different than, say, a viewing room for your images. So like your radiology department. And so oftentimes in that setting, you give what you need because of the security risk of where the data lives. So, and I guess the other piece to that is the business user, right? They're off in another building. You probably are going to give them a desktop. Yeah. So when you ask about, well, does it make sense to deploy a virtual desktop to another desktop, or a desktop OS to another desktop, versus, say, just restricting applications? I think it's very much organizationally enterprise specific based on use case. Yeah. Because security needs to come first and foremost in that scenario. And the other thing that, when you said that, when I see that customer choice option, thin client wise, there's a lot of different vendors and options out there, but iGel specifically, they deal with a lot of that and freedom of choice. Like, they have these tiny little UD pockets. They also have an iGel OS, where it's a thin client OS that can be deployed to just about any hardware. So again, it's that business need and what's going to secure the data while making sure they serve the customer properly. So
I did want to ask you, and I know we're running out of time now, so I'm going to be quite quick. If you were coming to VDI for the first time with Windows 365, you're a smaller business or larger business, and you're pivoting to using this because of the pandemic, perhaps. It would be easy to think, right, well, my thin client is the remote desktop app. So the MSI version of that, MSRDC, new version of NSTSC that works with that environment. or and that might be the end of the story. But then, of course, you'll see Microsoft talking about this stuff. You think, well, I'm not going to buy a computer. I'm not going to buy a Surface Book and then give them that, and then they'll VDI. You access the VDI platform from that, because then I'm buying two computers and I'm managing two computers. So I see that the software solutions on the market that are focused on virtual thin clients, and then there's thin clients themselves. What is the sort of state of play of either of those? Is it, if you're AVD, go down the Microsoft apps route, or is there a bit more to it than that from these vendors like ThinScale, and I suppose Wise, who have been around since before we were both born?
So again, it's customer choice, customer comfort. Like, in some of the organizations we worked in, we were all HPE, or we were all Dell. Yeah. And so when it came to making hardware choices that even went out to the endpoint, we'd sometimes make those decisions, at least start there, base it on what the corporate tolerance was for supportability. From there, you do an analysis of what's supported, and then you could technically pilot a couple different device types to make sure that they'll run the applications you want. You get the user experience you're looking for, to be able to make that choice. So, there are some good ones, right? I think Dell Wise seems to be one that stands out. iGel is another one of those emerging market players. I think they're actually a European-based company. Yeah. ThinScale may be a possibility as well, but that's at least how I see that decision matrix going. It's not like there's a magic answer. And
the thin clients, to me, obviously the green screen terminal, and then I used to have one on my desk. I'm only 41.
An AS400 mainframe was probably behind that.
No, it was digital Unix on a True 64, plugged in via serial cable to the computer room. But then after that, there was a point probably 10, 15 years ago where Linux-based platforms, and where I was with Sun, before being bought by Oracle, had a thin client platform that we were testing out. But I imagine the market must have moved on a little bit, because in a lot of cases it does seem that, say you were using Frame or one of these other vendors, or perhaps you just weren't happy with the way that Teams offload worked. Mm-hmm. You might want to be able to run a Windows app locally as well alongside it. Mm-hmm. Is there do any of these the modern thin clients from Dell, HP, and I genuinely don't know the answer to this, do they run things like Windows embedded as the OS, or is it all their own custom platforms?
So a Windows embedded OS on the thin client, they're really doing their own thing. It's their own flavor of something. It can look like Windows. I very much have worked with platforms that in the end it looks like a Windows OS that they're launching, and that's just to make sure that the end user has a similar experience. But in the end, I think, like you said, a lot of them are probably like a Unix-based something on the back end that's pushing this, and they're typically anything you're running on a thin client is going to be a virtual app or a virtual desktop.
That's the key word then, isn't it? Thin. So, thin clients from your normal vendor usually is a starting point. But then the supportability with the platform you're using. And because it's always going to be thin in almost all those circumstances that where you're deploying new hardware out to replace the old desktops, then you're going to want to make sure that you've got all the right mix of offload capabilities all in the mix based on what platforms you're using. So if you're Microsoft 365 all the way down with Teams, then more than likely you're going to want to make sure you've got that offload working, supported platform where Dell or whoever, HP, have worked with Microsoft to make sure the client itself works the right way, so all the offload works. And that's the key, rather than can it run the app locally or whatever for those edge cases.
Yep, spot on.
Keep it simple then. And it sounds,
keep it simple.
Keep it simple. Same vendor if you can. You know them, better the devil you know, good support contracts in place, unless you're unhappy with them, supported with the platforms that you're using inside the VDI environment, like Teams or Microsoft 365 Office apps, and then picking the right platform that works with Microsoft 365 and all the other apps that you've got, the line of business apps, the right way. Well, we've done VDI in a podcast, but, or at least scrape the surface of it.
I think we've scratched the surface. I feel like we could talk for at least another 20 minutes, but it is a podcast. And
well, the interesting thing is, if you went for Windows 365, all of that thin client side of that remains the same, doesn't it? All of those decisions around it, all of the decisions around where clients sit, what sits where, all of that's the same. You can get the machine, but as you say, it's not quite so simple as some of the pictures where they're wandering around with what appears to be a Surface laptop of some sort connected to Windows 365 in a deep, dark factory. There's everything that gets them to that endpoint is like a Teams call. You've got to make sure the voice signal is correct. This is the desktop that's being delivered.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. Even if you don't do something legacy on-prem, even if the cloud's involved, there's a lot of pre-work to make sure that that's running. Yeah, what you described was marketing.
Well, that was the thing that got me, because, and that is the final question. What if someone was starting out and maybe they were picking Windows 365 for the hospital, for example, what would be the one thing that you said to them before they started? Don't miss this.
So I think there's some assumptions in that question. We're going to assume they're not using anything legacy on-prem, and they're just going to go ahead and they're going to move forward with the Microsoft offering.
Let's assume their entire infrastructure just happens to be in Azure. They've got there's no latency issues, or it's complete SaaS apps. The Windows 365 works, and in a perfect environment, everything is performant and has been So assuming
so here's my advice.
Yes.
So my advice would be to test everything and pull in business stakeholders to help you test, because they will know best how an application is going to best serve them. They're going to know the performance they're expecting, and they're going to be able to give that final blessing to make sure that virtual desktop is functioning the best for the organization.
Yeah, that has reminded me of an Exchange project. Actually, Citrix was the client platform, but it didn't actually matter. Outlook in online mode, on-prem, and it looked fine. And this could apply to any business app. You test it, it seems fine. But then the business user uses it, and that half a second when you're clicking before something displays that seems fine, it's not the same. I can't use this. It's effectively quadrupled the time it takes to do anything, and you just wouldn't notice. Spot on advice. Brilliant. Easy one to miss though, isn't it?
To me, it's because as an admin, you sit behind the scenes and you test it, and you're like, oh, this is fantastic. But without that business stakeholder there to validate it, you'll deploy something and it won't work. And it's best to work through all of that before it's officially launched.
Yeah.
Everyone's happier, and the project is more successful.
And of course, normally with Microsoft 365, you move documents to the cloud. You're adding latency to accessing documents. You're changing the experience, so you know that it's not going to be the same as a local file. With Outlook, you're moving to cache mode. It's not going to be the same as it was before.
Yep.
But Microsoft 365 includes these things. It includes Windows 365. Now, as a Microsoft 365 admin, this may suddenly become something that you've got to deal with. The line of business app that is running in Azure apps should be fine. But now that, whilst you dealt with the expectation and challenges and different ways of work, you're moving to Teams, Office apps and OneDrive, this thing, is an immovable thing. The line of business app and the way it reacts needs to be at least as functional as it was, because that bit hasn't moved to the cloud really. Yeah. It's the same old app that they used before.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for joining us on the show today, Theresa.
Yeah, glad to be here. We'll have to chat again soon on something else or VDI continued.
Thank you.